welcome. If those of you who are towards the back want to move forward, there's obviously space up here, but if you think I know that there are sightline things that work better from back there. So thanks for coming. I'm Lou Brown from the Forum for Scholars in Publics, and our program tonight, as you see, is Veterans Observed, Veterans Observing. We have a super panel. I want to give you a little bit of background about why we're doing this and some other programming that we have coming up in the future. So we're doing this because we think these conversations need to happen. We need to, our veterans are part of our communities, and war is part of our life, but war is part of the world we live in, and a lot of us have assumptions about the people who go to war and the people who come home, and we don't really interrogate those assumptions sometimes. So we at the Forum for Scholars in Publics and our colleagues at Duke Divinity School, Warren Kinghorn, and the Duke Divinity veterans in particular. I see Giovanna Meek is here, Rob Densmore, Logan Isaac. These have all been people who've been in conversation with us for a long time, helping us think through these ideas and through these issues. So this is not a one-off program. We're hoping that some of the things we're talking about tonight and some of these guests themselves might be back in the future, but certainly these ideas are going to continue to percolate, and they're going to be things that we continue to investigate at Duke and at the Forum for Scholars in Public. So we invite your ideas also about ways that we can approach issues and questions that you've experienced or that you've observed, and so thank you for that.
Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. So good evening. It's good to be here with you all. It's good to be here with these witness bearers. I'm so excited to hear about your work, how you can help us make meaning of experiences that seem to be beyond understanding in many ways. I do want to just share a bit of why I'm sitting in this seat next to my fellow observers. I am a descendant of veterans. My mother was born at Fort Bragg because her father was enlisted in the Army as a sergeant. He did 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, and there was a lot of silence around that experience. We are African American, and when he was in Vietnam, the rest of my family, including my mother and her sisters and my grandmother, were living in Jim Crow conditions in Columbia, South Carolina, underneath the Confederate flag. And so to have the father, the protector, in that particular family gone away was particularly something that marked my family. My paternal grandfather served in World War II in Italy. He came back on a GI Bill and went to Shaw University, where he got a chemistry degree and ended up transitioning to Philadelphia to raise my father and his siblings. My great-grandfather suffered a burn. He was a burn survivor in World War II in North Africa. So as a folklorist and oral historian, the opportunity to bear witness to the stories of veterans, be they combat or support, career soldiers, has been a way for me to get to somehow connect to my ancestry, because there were no stories being shared by these men. The only story I heard of my grandfather coming back from Vietnam was that my grandmother chided him for not washing his white shirts because they looked orange. And he said, "I did wash them. These are clean." That is the only story I have. I do know that Vietnam veterans were always welcome at my grandmother's table, particularly on Fish Fry Fridays when James Brown would be played and potatoes were being fried. Sometimes they would ask, because they were struggling with different issues, could they just mow the lawn, whether the lawn needs mowing or not, my grandpa would say yes. So these are the snippets of stories that were making their way into my life, but so much silence. And so I craved a way to hear more and to teach students to document these stories, because I actually feel like the stories, I feel a responsibility. So when I learned about our panelists and the work that they're doing, I just wanted to sit up here and be a part. So with that, I think what we're going to do, we have our presenters here in order. We're going to hear about 10 minutes each from, which seems almost painful to cut it so short, but we're going to start with you all sharing a bit about your work. And we're going to hold off on questions until each of our guests have presented. And then we're going to have an open conversation. I'll help moderate that. I know that they want to talk to each other a bit, so we're going to save some room for some conversation among our panelists. And I certainly want you all to be thinking about comments, questions, observations, curiosities that you all have about what you hear and see. And because we're going to wait to the end to take comments from you all, if you want to just take a few notes along the way so that you don't, I don't want you to lose your questions for Zoe by the time we get to Shelly. So I'm a teacher, I have instructions, so that's the way I roll. But let's begin with Zoe.
Should I go up there or stay here?
Wherever you feel comfortable.
Okay, all right, I'll just stay here. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. As Lou mentioned, my book project is about ethnographic work that I did at Walter Reed. And I should also say that even if you do want to buy a copy afterwards, there's also some flyers for the book that are over by the door. And they're quite beautiful because we can also talk about the image that's on the cover of the book. Maybe a bit later. But what I'm going to share today is actually a piece of, kind of condensed piece of something that's in the book that's not actually about physically injured soldiers, but that is about the body and questions of the transformations that combat makes. So I'm just going to read it and offer it to us as a kind of thing to add to our thinking. So I'm sitting with Sophia in a coffee shop in a subway station in Manhattan. We had met once before at a press conference about the new GI Bill in Washington, D.C., where I was carrying out my fieldwork with soldiers at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Worried she might not remember what I looked like, I had arrived at our meeting a few minutes early. I thought I'd get a coffee and situate myself in view of the door, looking very anthropological with my notebook and my tape recorder laid out on the table so that she might recognize me. But after I get my coffee and double back to the seating area, I see her, already there, sitting at a small table for two in the chair facing the door and sipping a hot chocolate. We settle in and I pull out my notebook and turn on my recorder. I ask her to tell me about herself. She starts with the past, piecing together a story about what she was like. Born in the Dominican Republic, but equally American, one of 4 siblings, a tomboy, a churchgoer who tricked her mother into signing the forms that allowed her to join the military in 1999 at the age of 17 so that she could pay for college. It had been the obvious option. There was always that recruiter in the lunchroom and that recruitment office on the way home and all those posters in the subway. She figured she'd get herself a desk job, not that it mattered so much back then, back when, as she said, it was Clinton time. There was no war, no signs, no signs of nothing. I was like, there ain't gonna be no war, but little did I know. As we began to speak about her time in Iraq, as we move inexorably towards the present, we also begin to speak about coming back from war and about the inevitable strains of what is called re-entry, that atmospheric burn that makes painfully apparent the expectations about a then and there of life at war and a here and now of life at peace, a feeling that makes apparent certain irrevocable transformations. Sophia gestures at this difference when she tells me about the process of demobilization. You know, she says, they check you out quickly. They don't talk about it. They do it not individually, they do it everybody as a group, as a unit, you know, and be like, this is what happens, this is how it is, now remember how you were. I am incredulous and blurt out, remember how you were? Sophia confirms, remember how you were, and act just, be like that, remember that. And you're like, what? How was I again? Part of what makes it so impossible to be like that are the stubborn, visceral facts of being somehow something else. Sophia can remember what she used to do, the things she used to care about, how she used to spend her time, but her transformed mode of being in the world does not allow her to be like that, or even to remember with all her body and might what being like that would really be like. And now Sophia explains for me the ways in which she is and is different, the stories about what she likes and who she is in an identifiable, objectifiable, narratable, relational way fade. Instead, she begins telling me more about things that happen, about how when she returned from Iraq, she would freak out if her friends moved to hug her, about how she would reach for her weapon when walking down the street in Queens, about how, though she is ashamed to admit it, everybody that's from that country is a potential enemy. I came back almost like a racist. I don't want to say racist, but you come back looking at them like they're bastards. This atmospheric burn is not a story. It's not a narrativized self. It is more a characterization of vision and proprioception. It is a being in the midst of the world, a being that feels its way into existence. She comes back again and again to a refrain of ontological transformation, a transformation that is and that cannot be undone, a being that cannot be traded in for stories. She says it changes you. It changes the way you see people when you come back. Everyone is a suspect. Anything and everything, everyone is dangerous. Everything looks dangerous. She laughs. As she explores this difference between who she was and how she is, Sophia also begins to elaborate the significance of an embodied and emplaced being, a becoming through being that is not preceded by a simple identifiable subject. It is not that she is different. It is that as she moves through the world, difference becomes her. And so sitting there in the coffee shop in the subway station in Manhattan, Sophia begins to educate me, not only by telling me, but also by showing me, enacting for me, some things about the world that she knows, things that thus begin to include me in this worlding, like the way that we have come to sit together in this configuration. And she tells and shows me some other things that have happened and that are happening and that might happen here. She says, I like to pay attention to everything that's happening. But for instance, like right here, I'm able to see all the way to the end of the table. And like a lot of people can't, and I can see all the way to, my peripheral vision is so far out now. And maybe you notice I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at whoever's moving too fast. I'm like looking. As she says this, she exaggerates for my benefit the darting movement of her eyes, showing me how her eye sees, the view that her vision makes, in part by showing me her eye, by making her eye and its vision visible to me. Making her eye visible is a way of making sensible to me her own vision, an attempt to show me how she sees the world, this very coffee shop, transformed, and how she transforms it, and herself, and our encounter through her practices of seeing and moving, of coming and bringing into view. She continues, before I would have just walked in and sit down. Usually now, even though it's been a few years and I know how to live in the normal life with no guns, no nothing, I still look in and see what's my surroundings, see my potential, there's an exit over there, see if something happens over there, where can I go? I don't sit first, she says, laughing. I go right, I look left. So, I don't know if you were here when I did that. No, I say. Okay, because when I literally walk in, I stop over here and I look to my left, and I do that everywhere I go. It's the same thing when I go in the train. How many people are there? If I have to run, where do I go? Is it faster the other way or the other way? Where the poles are, so I know, so that's how I know, You walk into a place and you want to know which other exits, how, she pauses, how you would move through, I offer, hinting at the arc of possibility that is part of her experience, hinting at the ifs that her experience proliferates. If there was a bomb, if there was a gunman, if there was, as they say in military parlance, contact. Though she doesn't feel as jumpy as she was when she first returned to the normal life with no guns, no nothing, we see that far from her transformation being undone, far from returning to some untroubled previous mode of inhabiting her body and the world, this new being is the very condition of her ability to continue inhabiting a world in which she continues to be transformed. I ask her if this new way of being bothers her, and though she has explained it to me in exquisite detail, she says that it's unconscious. Far from bothering her, it actually makes her, she says, feel comfortable in a place. It's something that keeps my heart pumping slower, not like not like everything is dangerous. Her particular vision gives her not only the abstract feeling of comfort, but it changes the feeling of her heart in her chest. It steadies her sense of herself in her body as she moves through or resides in a place. And her newly educated eye, one that pushes her peripheral vision so far out now, and that allows her to see surroundings where everything is dangerous, also allows her to feel comfortable and not like everything is dangerous. Her new practice of seeing, her new vision of the world, keeps these two apparently incommensurate experiences suspended together in a way that plays out of her feeling of herself as she moves through space. Through visceral experiences of danger and comfort that continue to live in her body and in the world, experiences that refuse tenaciously to be put in other places like faraway war zones, Sophia's experience complicates the pathologies of being like post-traumatic stress disorder with its exaggerated startle response and restricted range of affect. And it complicates notions of return to the normal life or to being how you were. And while I have spoken here only of Sophia, and while not all American soldiers' experiences of homecoming will be the same, in my work with other soldiers, I find profound resonances with experiences that Sophia shows and tells so well. Each soldier's return, injured or not, each soldier's experience of coming to live again in a place left behind and yet transformed is marked by ways of seeing and becoming and the play of comfort and danger through which living becomes, or in so many cases, becomes unbearable.
So I know that, David, you're going to have images to share.
Yeah, it's probably best if I stand up there at the podium, and I'll just say a couple of words, and then we'll get right into the pictures. Maybe after I'll introduce my. Can you guys hear me okay up here? Yeah. I'll say a few words, and then you can turn the lights down. Is that good?
Should we make down there?
Okay, yeah. That's a much better idea.
While she's getting that set up, because I'm not really going to take you through the pictures one by one, just a tiny bit of background about me and how these came about. Although I've been a fashion photographer for the past, 20 years, I spend most of my time, these last 10 or so, working on long-term personal projects, images of poverty, abuse, disease, war, and of the antithesis of fashion. These last 3 years, I've been working on a series called The Unknown Soldier, which is a series of severely injured young men and women coming back from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I've tried to take them as honestly as I could and basically just get out of the way so that the viewer can have a moment with the subject. I tend to focus my work here in America because I find it a bit cliche to run off to some foreign land when we have all these things right in our own backyard. And perhaps they resonate a little more with you when you realize that that's the guy you went to second grade with. That being said, I hope the images are universal, both in their intent, which I know they are, and the feelings they evoke, which I hope they are. Ultimately, The Unknown Soldier is not really about veterans. As with most of my work, the images are as much about the viewer as the subjects themselves. I hope these pictures transcend the narrow and simplistic confines of war and veterans, as if those are things that just happen. They don't just happen. We create them. We make them happen. And I take the pictures because I think it's important to see what we create, the kind of the fruit of our collective endeavors. So this is just one kind of, a bit of a series that has opened in Washington, D.C. this past year. And I've added a few extras. The actual prints are about 5 feet across. They're a little blurry on this, I don't know why, but I'm just gonna flip through them. I'm not gonna speak about them, I'll go kind of slow. And later on, you can ask questions if you'd like when we're all done with all of this. So I'm just gonna flip through.
So what I'm going to read is a condensed version of a more comprehensive argument that I made in an essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books, and it's also part of an ongoing project I'm working on about the history of trauma in American literature, specifically having to do with the American literature from World War II, from the 40s to the 70s. And I'll just say one thing about where this came out of. After getting out of the Army and going back to school, I I was really interested in how trauma came to be the central narrative, the primary way of understanding the war in Iraq, which, as we all know, it was a war of choice, and it was a war fought by volunteer service. And so I found it very interesting as a veteran that these narratives that seemed to have a lot more to do with Vietnam were shaping how people were understanding Iraq politically, narratively, culturally. So I wanted to understand where trauma came from, what it was, and why it came to be the main way we understand war. And then as that developed, and I started looking more at the American literature of World War II, I became more and more interested in the question of what trauma does. And that's sort of what this discusses. Every true war story is a story of trauma and recovery. A boy goes to war, his head full of romantic visions of glory, courage, and sacrifice, his heart yearning to achieve heroic deeds. But on the field of battle, he finds only death and horror. He sees, suffers, and causes brutal and brutalizing violence. Such violence wounds the soldier's very soul. After war, the boy, now a veteran and a man, returns to the world of peace haunted by his experience, racked by the central compulsion of trauma and atrocity. The struggle between the need to bear witness to his shattering encounter with violence and the compulsion to repress it. The veteran tries to make sense of his memory, but finds it all but impossible. Most people don't want to hear the awful truths that war has taught him. The political powers that be want to cover up the shocking reality of war, and anybody who wasn't there simply can't understand what it was like. The truth of war, the veteran comes to learn, is a truth beyond words, a truth that can only be known by having been there, an unspeakable truth he must bear for society. So goes the myth of the trauma hero. This myth informs our politics, shapes our news reports, and underwrites our history. It dominates critical and scholarly interpretation of war literature, war movies, and the visual culture of war. It shapes how we understand Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and World War II, and it affects whom we vote for. Like all myths, this story frames and filters our perceptions of reality through a set of recognizable and comforting conventions. It works to convince us that war is a special kind of experience that offers a special kind of truth, a truth that gives those who have been there a special kind of authority. The trauma hero myth also serves a scapegoat function, discharging national blood guilt by substituting the victim of trauma, the soldier, for the victim of violence, the enemy. Take Clint Eastwood's adaptation of Chris Kyle's memoir, American Sniper. The story, as everyone knows, is of the life and death of Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, who as a shooter in Iraq racked up more confirmed kills than any other sniper in American military history. Kyle served 4 tours in Iraq as a trigger puller, then retired and began to work with disabled and traumatized veterans. One day, one of those veterans shot him. The opening scene of the film sets the moral stakes. Our hero, played all lockjaw, 1,000-yard stare, and darting eyes by Bradley Cooper, must decide whether or not to shoot an Iraqi child whose mother gave him a grenade to throw at an American convoy. Never mind the tired Vietnam-era trope of the bomb-wielding child, a fiction that Eastwood grafted onto Kyle's less sensational autobiographical account of shooting a woman. What's important in this scene is that we're being shown what extremes of psychological torment our hero must endure, and this is only the beginning. Such suffering is the upshot of the whole narrative, which is an account of Kyle's increasing combat stress and the toll that stress takes on his family, layered over with a simplistic dueling sniper's plot, both of which culminate in a climactic rooftop battle scene. In this scene, Kyle draws on his years of training and warrior wisdom to make an impossible shot, killing the sniper Mustafa. As a gibbering horde of Iraqi insurgents descends upon our American heroes, Kyle calls his wife by satellite phone and tells her he's ready to come home. A dust storm envelops the battle, and the Americans fight their way out, barely escaping. In a visually striking chaos that serves as a symbolic baptism, Kyle is sucked into the whirlwind. He's been reborn. The last scenes of the film intimate Kyle's recuperation. Cooper loses his 1,000-yard stare and lets his jaw relax, revealing a man who has learned how to turn the lessons of war into the lessons of peace. Instead of helping endangered soldiers by killing Iraqis, he has learned to help wounded soldiers by talking with them and mentoring them in shooting range therapy. The final scene of the film, before the documentary footage of Kyle's actual flag-bedecked funeral, is of Kyle as father and husband, warm, joking, engaged with his wife and children. American Sniper focuses in tight on one man's story of trauma, leaving out the complex questions of why Kyle was in Iraq being traumatized in the first place. The Iraqis in the film are villains, caricatures, and targets, and the only real opinion on them the film offers is Kyle's. The Iraqis are all savages who threaten American lives and need to be killed. There's some truth in this representation, insofar as this is precisely how a lot of American soldiers thought of Iraqis. Yet the film obviates the question of why any American soldiers were in Iraq, why they stayed there for 8 years, why they had to kill thousands and thousands of Iraqi civilians, and how we are to understand the long and ongoing bloodbath once called the War on Terror. It does that by turning a killer into a victim, a war hero into a trauma hero. The film, American Sniper, is a fictional account created out of a nonfiction memoir. And this raises interesting questions about how that happens and what that means and what it means in terms of narrative and narrative analysis. But it's important because it's emblematic of much contemporary war literature, and it's emblematic of this trauma hero narrative at large. And the ramifications of this narrative are profound and wide-reaching. In one of the most substantial recent articles on contemporary war literature, the journalist George Packer in The New Yorker reads contemporary war literature as a set of variations on this very myth, on the trauma hero myth. He focuses specifically on the Wilfred Owen, Ernest Hemingway, Tim O'Brien lineage, while ignoring works that don't fit that frame. And I could bore you with a list of really interesting war literature that doesn't fit that. Where Packer missteps most precipitously, however, is where he considers war literature in its historical and political contexts, and indeed in how he compares it with nonfiction. Journalists and historians have to distort war, Packer writes. In order to find the plot, causation, sequence, meaning, they make war more intelligible than it really is. In the literature by veterans, there are virtually no politics or polemics, he goes on, in stark contrast to the tendentious way in which most Americans, especially those farthest removed from the fighting, discussed Iraq. This new writing takes the war, though not its terrible cost, as a given. Packer's not just wrong here. What he's saying is actually dangerous. What he's saying presumes that journalists and historians adhere to conventions of understanding, causation, sequence, meaning, whereas novelists and poets don't, which not only offers a patently nonsensical way of approaching literature, but also makes extravagant demands upon it. How could a writer possibly communicate any experience without making it more intelligible than it really is? Making experience intelligible is just what language does. Further, Packer makes the specious assumption that ignoring the causes, background, and motivating forces for a war represents an absence of politics, rather than seeing it for what it is, which is a kind of politics. Namely, a politics of forgetting that actively elides the question of what U.S. soldiers were fighting for and the bigger problem of who they were killing, in favor of the more narrow and manageable question of what it was like. Packer's tendentious argument highlights the most troubling consequences of our faith in the revelatory truth of combat experience and our sanctification of the trauma hero. That by focusing so insistently on the psychological trauma American soldiers have had to endure, we allow ourselves to forget the death and destruction those very soldiers are responsible for. The works that Packer reviews, and there's several of them, along with films such as American Sniper, may portray a loss of innocence that makes the dirty war in Iraq palatable as an individual tragedy. but they only do so by obscuring the connection between American audiences and the millions of Iraqi lives destroyed or shattered since 2003. Focusing on the suffering soldier or suffering veteran allows us to forget the suffering of the very people whose land was occupied in our name. If the point of literature is to help us, quote, recognize our own suffering in the stories of others, as Packer asserts, rather than soothing our troubled consciences with precisely the stories that we want to hear, then the novels he considers, such as Kevin Power's Yellow Birds and others, and movies such as American Sniper, are gross moral and artistic failures. But the failure doesn't belong just to the writers, or it may not even belong to the writers at all. It belongs to the readers and citizens who expect veterans to play out for them the ritual of trauma and recovery, and to carry for them the collective guilt of war. Such an expectation is the privilege of those who can afford to have others do their killing for them. Offloading the problem of war onto the figure of the traumatized veteran, however, has long-term costs we have yet to reckon. The imperative to see war clearly is persistent and as urgent today as ever as U.S. military forces return to Iraq and a new kettle of hawks cry for war in Ukraine and Syria. Understanding the problem of American political violence demands recognizing soldiers as agents of national power and understanding what kind of work the trauma hero is doing when he comes bearing witness in his bloody fatigues.
Good evening. A little closer. Okay, put my nose to this side. Every time I'm asked to speak about veterans, I go through all of the people who have taught me really everything that I know, and those are largely military chaplains. I teach theology, which means I teach a lot of people who are going to be religious leaders, who carry responsibility for the faith claims of their tradition, and are also caregivers in a very unique way within a military setting. So I never really thought about war until these people entered my classroom. It was never a research agenda for me. I had done a lot of work in the study of trauma, and was looking at what trauma distinctively says about theologies of suffering in various traditions, but particularly in the Christian tradition. And when military chaplains started entering my classroom, they were telling me about experiences that were really unbelievable and in many senses for them inarticulable. They were carrying responsibility for caregiving while in tours of duty, and themselves were having a hard time grappling with what was going on. So they are my teachers, and I feel like they're with me in the room whenever I speak. I'm a scholar in the Christian tradition, which means I read a lot of texts throughout the history of that tradition, and those texts, as is no surprise to many in this room, become very authoritative texts for how people make meaning of what happens to them. They're texts out of which theodicies generate. Why is something happening to me? Is God punishing me? Is God testing me for my faith? They're meaning-making texts that lead to practices in many ways, as probably Zoe would say, they weigh heavily on people's bodies. And I was concerned when veterans and military chaplains were coming in my classroom. I was very aware of how these authoritative texts within a Christian tradition, I could say a kind of cultural Christianity that pulses through our nation's veins. We can talk about that could be a controversial term, but a kind of logic of how we think about sacrifice, has a kind of Judeo-Christian patterning, how that kind of logic feeds war and also feeds the healing process for many. And that for me, the job as a theologian was to track the way that particular texts can be deployed for harm and for healing, the same texts, right? And so people would describe the ways in which experiences that happened to them, that somehow their faith tradition gave them a way to work through that experience. Those are what I call the kind of descriptive function of those claims. My concern was the prescriptive function, right? The more pain, the more someone loves you, right? The more suffering, God's going to load it on you so that you can get to a better place. Those are prescriptive ways in which I say theology functions. And I'm concerned about those. I'm concerned about the ways that those are used and the ways in which they're mobilized not only on an individual faith level, but on a much larger level, institutional level, national level. So I go often in my work to what I call the central nerve point in the Christian tradition, which is the narrative of the cross and resurrection. It's the central story in that tradition. It's the central story that narrates both kind of suffering and sacrifice and resurrection and kind of new life. And that death-life narrative is often told with a very triumphant trajectory, that death is conquered in the act of the cross and new life is ahead. And that kind of triumphant linear sequencing is, I think, often the heavy weight of a logic that weighs on people for whom the life ahead of them is not triumphant, it's not victorious, and that kind of logic is actually more debilitating than healing. So my work has been to rethink that central story, and one of the chapters of a book that I just handed into the publisher, that always feels really good, is rethinking one of the central stories that whether or not you're in the Christian tradition or not, you probably recognize it. It's the Doubting Thomas story. And I wish I put it up there along David's images, because it's a wound picture where Thomas is kind of plunging his finger into the wounds of the resurrected Jesus. And that picture of Thomas as the doubter who comes to faith is a kind of triumphant wound story that I think has lost its meaning as a healing story. It's about the truth of Christian faith, it's about Thomas comes to believe, and it gets kind of catapulted into this whole different truth story, and often the wounds are erased. So it's like they're there, but they're covered over, you don't really see them. And I found that going back in the Christian tradition and reading commentaries on this Doubting Thomas story, in fact, there are theologians who say once Thomas is invited to touch the wounds and comes to believe, the wounds disappear. They're no longer necessary because you can't have an ascended resurrection body with wounds in heaven, right? This is what theologians do. We track this. And I thought, wow, isn't it interesting that the wounds are just kind of temporary in order to get Thomas to believe? But in fact, the wounds kind of remain in the tradition. And I was really interested in thinking about how do you tell a story of resurrection when the wounds are still there? And that's not a hard question to ask when you're working in the area of trauma and when you're seeing the kind of pictures that David is showing and the kind of stories that Roy writes about, that kind of wound stories. And so my work is really focused on rethinking that particular narrative. How am I on time? A couple more minutes? And I was invited into a veteran healing group. So the last chapter of my book is an attempt at an ethnography. I stumbled into this group through invitation, like I did everything, right? People would invite me to do things, invite me and say, we're doing really interesting work with veterans, do you want to come see it? And I said, sure. And this veteran healing group, it's a group called Warriors Journey Home. It's a group that's located in Talmadge, Ohio. And they're unique in a couple ways, and I think we could talk about kind of the veteran healing process and what's helpful and not. This group actually follows a circle process, and it involves not only veterans but civilians. And the civilians who are involved in that group, often family members, sometimes people who just, people themselves who didn't serve. I interviewed a guy who actually had a lot of guilt about avoiding the draft, and felt really moved to come back and be part of the veteran healing process. And I interviewed largely the civilians who were involved in the process, because I thought, oh, I'm going to interview these veterans because for many of them, this group has been life-saving. And I found out that the civilians had a story to tell about what it means to be part of the healing process. So the one thing is it's interesting to have it be a larger communal process, that the civilians themselves are taking a kind of collective responsibility for the healing process. But the other thing that was interesting is that it was co-led by a Protestant minister and a ceremonial healer in the native tradition, and the rituals and practices in this group were kind of a funky move between native practices and kind of Christian rituals, and the movement between that. And I was so curious about that. I was like, okay, this is like my bread and butter work. Like, I'm a theologian. Like, how does this really work to have these two traditions? And the veterans and civilians totally uninterested in my question. And they said, we don't care whatever words you use. We're about the healing. I got a really amazing education from this group, because the things that I thought should concern us were not of concern. And I'm going to just end with a statement that Cheyenne, who is the ceremonial healer, she's also a trained psychotherapist, so it's also interesting, with a very deep trauma history, of course, the trauma history of her peoples, but also a residential school trauma history. And she sees herself as a healer, irrespective of who you are. She says, hurt goes to hurt. I was asking her, how does she do the work that she does? And she said, my hurt knows their hurt. And it doesn't always have to be named in all its particularity, but the fact that it knows I go to it. And the kind of work of a healer was very, very interesting to me, was a logic that kind of cut through some of the dogmatism of religion for people. And that group kind of gave me an education about thinking about the collective life together, about rituals, the power of rituals, healing. I think I'll end there.
I'm going to unmute. Can you all hear me? Oh, I can hear me. Wow. It's a lot swirling in the air. And I've been taking lots and lots of notes. There's lots of phrases that are resonating for me. And I want to start with some things that Roy brought up, and perhaps, just to be transparent, this may be a spirit of deference to the fact that you are our lone combat veterans here. So I just want to be transparent about what I think might be driving my desire to start with you. I'm really interested in the fact that I hear in your writing, stitched through this strong desire for these alternate narratives, this strong desire to really stare in the face, this trauma hero myth. Really fascinated by your work around looking at, what about the other side of this story? What about the other side of the death and destruction? And are we not perhaps gazing in a singular way when there's actually a whole spherical, not even just circular, but there's this sphere, a whole globe that we're missing. And what strikes me about each of you is that you're all presenting for us and for others counter narratives. And so I just wanted to see if maybe you could start us out, Roy, and then if others hear something that you want to dive in around, let's really explore these counter narratives, this notion.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, that was, so this was a sort of, I was originally going to give a somewhat different talk. And what I was going to talk about there was sort of what I think, one of the things I think fiction is especially good at when it comes to writing war. And this sort of came out from responses to Fire and Forget, and questions people would ask: why write fiction about a war that's still going on? Why not just tell us what happened, and tell us what does fiction do that's better or different? And I gestured to it today, but I think to be more explicit about it, I think what fiction can do and what fiction sort of has built into it is a multiplicity of perspectives. In the very idea that I'm telling, even if it's a first person story, the very fact that there's an author and a reader, and then the fictional narrator of the story, there's already three people, right? 3 points of view that have to be negotiated. And then when you push that into, multiple perspectives, multiple narrators, the polyphony and the opportunity to, I think, depict a rich, multi-perspectival world grows. And indeed, not to plug it, but my war novel coming out in August, War Porn, is it's told in three main narratives. One of a young woman, civilian, at home in Utah, who's a friend of hers, brings a veteran to her party, and ruins the party. And another narrative is an American soldier in Iraq, and then the core narrative, they're sort of structured like matryoshka dolls, like Russian nesting dolls. The core narrative is about an Iraqi mathematician during the American invasion, and he comes back in the other sections. And so I was really working to create this sort of, not a funhouse, but a kind of mirroring effect where we see these different perspectives from different perspectives. Yeah, and my intent with that wasn't necessarily to create a counter narrative, so much as it was to try to understand the Iraq War from something beyond what my experience of it was, and beyond the representations that I saw being offered about it, right? I wanted a bigger sense of it. So
I think the nesting dolls is a useful metaphor, because what I'm hearing is, those of us who are civilians who are drawn to the wound stories, we are trying to make sense of our veterans, I think most intimately. And then what I hear you doing as a veteran writer is making sense of the war, but also these others, where there's this invisibility for civilians of the veteran experience, I think you're highlighting this other group that we're also not addressing, the Iraqi mathematicians, in the world.
Right, right.
That we're connected.
Yeah. I mean, and there's an interesting, there's a thing, there's a sense I struggle with, there's something I struggle with, especially, and you probably got some of that in this, what I read today, with this idea of, dare I say it, of othering, war, othering veterans. I think, and there's much talk about the military-civilian gap and the military-civilian divide, but I actually don't think it's as gappy as all that. I think actually it's much closer than we would like to admit. And I think the work that American soldiers do overseas is not as dissimilar from the work that American police do here in the United States, or from the work that that other Americans do overseas in diplomatic service or for corporations or what have you. But there's a way in which by making that work something special, by sort of insisting that we can't understand it, I would even go so far as to say we sacralize it in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think, this gap, which has all kinds of political effects, right, is mobilized to kind of to valorize and to make sacred these actions, and also to depoliticize them thereby, right? Shelly, what you're talking about, the way this is one of the prescriptive functions, right, that we're seeing play out here, this model of sacrifice, as Roya, you're saying, it kind of offers us this sacrificial victim, and the purification that's happening in that sacrifice is on behalf of everybody else. Right. And one of the things that I try to do in my work, and that was kind of part of the experience for me of doing the ethnographic work that I did and writing about it and thinking about it, was precisely to try and point out the kinds of contiguity that there are between these different kinds of experiences, and maybe you're to think about the way that you have the SCAR project and then you have the Unknown Soldier project, that you're showing us these bodies that we read in very different ways, but you're trying to show us, as you say, something that's kind of universal about these bodies, maybe. And the first bit of fieldwork that I did was actually in Germany at the American Military Hospital in Landstuhl. And before I was going, I thought, I've never been on a military base. I don't know any soldiers or veterans. What is this going to be like? I'm so kind of intimidated by this experience. Probably also mobilizing tropes of difference that anthropology traffics in. Right. And then I sort of stopped to think about it, and I was like, oh, my best friend's father growing up was a Vietnam War veteran and a medic during Vietnam. And my grandfather was also injured in World War II in North Africa. And my mother's brother was in the Air Force. And all of these things never constituted a military family or a military context, which is a term that people often use when they come from a tradition of career soldiers, rather than people who enlist and come out, right? But it was for me a kind of dawning of my own implication and not only my own implication in war, because I had been active as an anti-war activist and so was kind of aware of that stuff already, but my implication in the production of this kind of distance and difference, right? And so in the book, one of the key ways that I try and do this is by playing with the word ordinary and extraordinary, right? And trying to insist that, that when we, because one of the ways that people talk about injured veterans and injured soldiers in particular is to say that they are extraordinary. People talk about non-injured veterans also as being extraordinary, talk about their service as being extraordinary, and they also mobilize this idea of the unimaginable, right? It's unknowable, it's unimaginable, it's unspeakable, but that is one of my pet peeves. I think it's actually a kind of reneging of ethical responsibility to say that something is unimaginable, because it may or may not be knowable, right? And in part of what I'm trying to do in the piece that I read for you today is to say, there is a difference between Sophia's embodied experience and my embodied experience, but it's not unimaginable to me, right? And it's an ethical failure on my part if I say that it's unimaginable.
And that the question of naming what's unspeakable. There's an easy sort of Foucauldian sort of point to make about that. That's a way of speaking about it by naming it as unspeakable. It's a way of designating something, a way of constructing a discourse around a subject that that allows us to keep talking about it all the time, but in a way that also allows us to disavow it from ourselves and from our daily lives. One of the interesting things I thought about what you read was how the soldier said, in talking about the persistent sort of, her persistent phenomenology of racism, but she didn't want to say racism, right? But that's what it is. I mean, that's what it, that's, what it, and that was my experience of it in Iraq. I mean, that's how it, there's a very clear racial and national distinction that you come to live with. But that's a very good example of, this is what it is, but we don't want to name it. We want to name it as not nameable, right, as part of this bigger phenomenon.
I want to turn to David for a moment, naming the unnameable, and then there's a word that's bubbling up for me hearing this discourse, which is intimacy. So as we face and confront we talked about the mythology of the triumphant, trauma survivor, but also the mythology of the gap that you're asking us to look at. And David, for me, your work helps to confront the mythology of the gap that, as I hear you talk, and we had a chance to talk earlier, that this is us, what we're seeing, maybe kind of sounds Buddhist, but I am that, there's this inner exchange of soul, as, we're seeing ourselves in these people.
Yeah, as I was saying, I really try to get out of the way when I take these pictures so that the viewer can just have a moment with the subject. And it's been said that the viewer has an opportunity to change places with the subject and live behind their eyes. That was something that was written about these just for a moment. And I understand that, having stood there myself and had that feeling. That's actually why one of the reasons I take the pictures, so that we can feel this kind of this oneness, this unity, not just with these men, but with humanity in general. All of the pictures I take, whether they're about disease or abuse or poverty or all these other things that I like to focus on, it's easy to look at them either very intellectually or in a very abstract manner or in any other way, except I understand your pain and I'm going to try to behave in a way that stops that from happening to other people, including myself, that we're all part of this very kind of tightly woven and very real, kind of subatomic interaction where we're all so entwined, like in the most literal sense, we're all part of this fabric. And I think feeling what the other person is feeling, whether that's racially, culturally, politically, in all the ways that we clash or mesh, and trying to have a very humane understanding and realizing that, in the case of the unknown soldier, the war, as I said, we create this. This stuff doesn't just happen. What are we doing? I mean, that's where I end up with all this stuff, is what the hell are we doing there in the first place? And I think personally, I think it's, I don't think this is a tightrope anyway, and I probably shouldn't be walking there, but, are we really there defending America? Is that still a question that we're there defending America? I doubt you would say that we are. But I'm not sure what we're doing there, but I do know that we're all kind of part of the problem because it still exists, that in the year 2016, we're still playing the same game where we're sending young men and women overseas to fight this war under the pretext of protecting us in America. What's going on here? And why do we continue to allow this? And I'm not some kind of anti-war activist, not that there's anything wrong with that. I just honestly don't understand. And I think photographing these people, for me, often the whole reason I photograph the subjects I do is just to give me an understanding of what's going on and how they think. And obviously I've been doing this for shooting these guys, that's probably a bad word here too, photographing these men for the last 3 years and having these very kind of honest conversations with them. And so many of them were fascinating, this whole hero thing, which they're just not into in general. They are just not, that's a onlooker thing, this hero. They're like, I am not a hero because I got my legs blown off. I'm a guy that got my legs blown off and now my life is screwed, basically. And that doesn't really make me a hero. And, and also one of the reasons is so many of the images we see about the war or numbers, it's this many killed, this many injured, but you never really see them. And when you hear about injured people, you think about, oh, maybe they were shot, or you see them in the Paralympics and they're all doing great and they're getting back into society and, and everyone's coming in to help and tell them thank you for your service. A lot of these guys, it's just not true. Unfortunately, a lot of these guys don't get past what you just saw. How do you get past that? I mean, I certainly couldn't get past that. And that's really all I have to say.
David, I have some words that kind of came up for me as I was looking at the images, and I want to see if maybe some of them will resonate with Shelly and maybe shift to some commentary from you. So some of the words that came up were rebellion and freedom and tenderness and strength. Tenderness twice for me came up as I looked at it. And broken but resilient, connected, imprint in every meaning of that word, imprint. Anger, surrender, weightlessness. I did this. This is me. So those are phrases that came up for me.
All of that is there. I mean, I think in all of this discussion and the pictures, there's so many layers to all of this. There's all of those are correct. Everything is true. All the good is true and all the bad is true. That's just the reality of being a human being on Earth too, I think. And just recognizing that is probably important. I think too, what was really interesting with a lot of these guys is I was so surprised that obviously some of them are very angry about what has happened and feel that they were misled by the government and ended up in this situation and just feel they were basically lied to. You may have recognized Thomas Young up there who actually passed away after that photograph and who wrote a very scathing letter to Cheney and Bush and passed away soon after that. There was some of these men were obviously very angry, but I was even more surprised by the men who said, you know what, if the military would let me, I'd go back tomorrow. And when I asked them if they wanted their children to enlist, they'd said absolutely. And honestly, what was kind of beautiful is that their hearts are in the right place. They are really, in their mind, they're doing it for the right reason. And they had some beautiful stories. I mean, these are incredibly good people. It's hard to get your head around the different types of people and the reason that they're doing the things that they're doing. And that it's all somehow okay and understandable. I come away even more confused than when I started, to be honest. But yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I wanted to go back to something that you said just a moment ago about how do you get past that? And I think this is an interesting thing that I think about a lot. In part because, I I work a lot on looking at World War II and representations of veterans post 1945, there's an interesting disparity between that period. There are many interesting disparities between that period and this period, but one of them is that in addition to the kinds of films and books that explicitly highlight veterans as veterans, or that talk about disabled veterans, the best years of our lives, or some came running, or things like that. There's this burst, there's this efflorescence in the culture of figures of veterans who are, it seems accidental in a certain way to their identity. Revolutionary Road, for example, or The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Stories about, and there's certainly ways we could sort of read these potentially as post-traumatic narratives, but what I'm trying to get at is that, and I think this is in part because World War II was such a widespread experience for so many veterans. There were so many more narratives then of reintegrated veterans, of civilians who had been soldiers once. Whereas I'm hard pressed to think of examples of that today. It seems like the kinds of narratives and representations of veterans that we see in contemporary American culture are predominantly of veterans who are stuck in their veteran identity. And I see this with a lot of young vets myself. In writing programs or art programs or just whatever in their life. And I struggle with this myself too, trying to get past that. And it's hard to find a way to integrate that veteran experience into a civilian identity that doesn't put the veteran experience at the forefront, often in terms of trauma.
Shelly, will you talk a little bit about that? You talk a lot in your writing about these transformative moments and kind of that spiritual arc. I'm sure you have, I noticed you were jotting down.
I have a note to connect to some of I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and I had just finished reading Zoe's book, is that all of us are trying to think about how to tell stories. I'm thinking about how do I get at the jugular of the sacred story, which has such a hold in a particular way. And I mean, you use kind of counter narratives, but I thought about that the image that I have after reading Zoe's stuff is that there's a kind of insistence on telling the story closer to the surface of the skin. And that when I see those images, it's so interesting. It's like, it's not sight. You would think that like seeing was the primary thing, because it's like a photographer. You're like viewing images, and maybe it's just because I've been living in a certain touch world in the kind of analysis of touch that I'm doing around the kind of wound stories, but it's like the texture of the scars. It's not a kind of flattened story. Like, so visually I see this texture, and a lot of, I think, what maybe certain fictions do or certain stories that we tell is they kind of hover above the realities, and whether it's an anthropology of like the how you depict the other, that we have certain ways in which it's really hard to kind of tell the more complex textured stories. So I was thinking that's something that kind of feeds across the different things. And for me, fiction is such a powerful, it tells a story that is your own but it's not your own, and it creates a kind of porous movement that opens up, I think, moral space. I don't know, that you got to wrestle with how the story turns out. That fiction creates, that I would say in most cases, theology does not create. Like, I think there's wonderful stuff being done in theology, theopoetic moves, but it loses often the story part of the sacred story. And fiction has the texture like your photos do, and like you kept using proximity and intimacy, and you want to somehow defy the control that your own discipline has over the way that you sit with Sophia. It's powerful.
There's so much more I really want to talk to these folks about, but I know that we're approaching the close of our time, and I want to make sure that you all have space to ask questions of our presenters. And first of all, I just want to thank you all again for this wonderful.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.